If we take a look at this animal phylogenetic tree, want to remind ourselves that the animal group is going to be monophyletic. So we have a single ancestral protist, which is thought to have been a flagellated protist, that gave rise to all of the different animal phyla. We've talked about the invertebrates, and now in this chapter we're going to focus on the vertebrates. The vertebrates are going to be part of this clade down here at the bottom, which is called deuterostomia. So as we go through this chapter, we're going to talk about the origin and the evolution of vertebrate animals. Now, vertebrates are thought to have first arose in the oceans. And to date, we know of about 52,000 species. So this is a much smaller number than the invertebrate species that we looked at in the last chapter. So there's a lot less of these, but overall, they're going to be more familiar animals to us because they are much larger animals in a lot of cases, and many of them are going to be terrestrial. So first off, we're going to be talking about chordates, and we want to know, what are chordates? Well, chordates are animals that are part of the phylum Chordata. And what makes them chordata, we're going to go through a number of the characteristics or derived characteristics that we find here in this phylum. But first of all, one of the things is that they are going to be bilaterally symmetric. And these are also going to be part of the deuterostomia clade. So if we talk about some of the derived characteristics, you can see the derived characteristics kind of written all over here along the side of this phylogenetic tree. As we go through these different derived characteristics, when each of them is being evolved, that's going to give us a lot of different groups that we can see over here on this side. So we will have a lot of animals that are called chordates, and then we will have fewer that are called craniates, and then we can basically divide them down a lot farther. So we're going to go through each of these groups and talk about them. We start first with the derived characteristics of the chordates. All of the derived characteristics of the chordates are shown here highlighted in yellow. So if we talk about each of those, the first one is what we call the notochord. The notochord is going to be present in all chordates. Sometimes it's present in the adults. All of the time it's going to be present in the larvae or in the embryos. And this is going to be a flexible rod that's going to run the length of the organism. This is going to be fluid-filled cells that are enclosed within fibrous tissue. It's going to provide a lot of structural support. And eventually, if we're talking about human vertebrae, they do ultimately form from this notochord. If we talk about the dorsal hollow nerve cord, this is a cord that's going to be dorsal to the notochord, and this is going to eventually develop into the central nervous system. So I'm going to put that as the CNS. So it's going to develop into the central nervous system, which includes the brain, ultimately when we get to some of the more developed groups. And this is going to also form the spinal cord in those groups. Some other animal phyla that are not chordates, they will have a solid nerve cord in them, and it's also going to be ventral in those. If we look at the pharyngeal slits or clefts, these are going to be grooves that are along the pharynx. These are going to open up to the outside of the organism. And this is going to allow water to exit the body without having to pass fully through the digestive tract. So if water comes in the mouth, it can go ahead and exit through the pharyngeal slits or the grooves. This is going to function in feeding and in some cases gas exchange as well. We're also going to have a muscular post-anal tail, and with all of these characteristics, you might see them in just a portion of the life cycle of the chordate. These aren't necessarily things that have to be present in all of the stages, So in some cases, and in many cases really, they'll just be present in the embryo perhaps, and then we may not see them in the adult form of the animal. So if we go back to our phylogenetic tree here, the very first group that we want to take a look at is the Cephalochordata right here. This group is going to be what we call the lancelets. So the lancelets are going to be the most primitive of the chordates, or the basal chordates for that matter. If we look at them here, so this is the Cephalochordata that we're looking at. As we said, these are going to be called the lancelets. The lancelets are named that because they have a blade-like shape to them. These are going to be fairly small animals. They're going to, most of the time, be buried down in the sand. So these are marine animals. And these are also going to undergo a metamorphosis from a larva to an adult, which is going to be a swimming adult. And that swimming adult is going to move with a very simple swimming motion. The next group that is a little more advanced than the Cephalochordata is what we call the Urochordata. The Urochordata is what we tend to call the tunicates. And the tunicates, their common name is a sea squirt, and this has to do with their ability to squirt some water. And if we look at the overall shape of them, we can see all of those chordate characters when we look at the embryo or the larval form, but when we get to the adult form, which is what we're seeing in this middle picture, some of those characteristics are going to disappear. So if we look at the adult is going to have the notochord, and then also the tail are going to be reabsorbed so that they're no longer present. And then a lot of the other structures are going to get totally turned around and rearranged. So the adult looks quite a bit different from the larval stage. These are going to be filter feeders. The water comes in and then it's going to exit, and when it exits, that's that squirt part. So we call it the sea squirt. These have very few Hox genes compared to the other chordate groups. If we take a look at some of the genes that are involved in the evolution of the head, we can see these same genes being expressed if you look at a lancelet embryo. And a lancelet is not going to be a craniate at all. It doesn't have a head, but it does have a swollen tip on the end of the nerve cord. And if you look here, these two genes that we're looking at, these genes are going to also be expressed in the brain of what ultimately becomes a vertebrate. So we do start to see the beginnings of the evolution of a brain or of a head when we look at something as simple as a lancelet. If we talk about some of the derived characteristics of the craniate group, first off, they do have a head. So as far as what the head is going to entail, this is going to have a brain, and it's also going to have a lot of sensory input. So you may have eyes and other structures that can collect that sensory input, which can then be processed by the brain. This is also going to be located on the anterior end of the organism. We also have here what's called the neural crest. The neural crest is going to be a collection of cells, they're shown in green on this slide, that start to form where that hollow nerve cord is beginning to close up. These neural crest cells are going to develop, and eventually they're going to become a lot of different parts of the skull. So some of them are going to develop into teeth, some will develop into skull bones or cartilage, a lot of different things that come from those. So we've got, in this case, we've got the head, we've got the neural crest. Another thing here is that the pharyngeal slits are going to develop or evolve into gill slits. These gill slits are going to be important for oxygen or gas exchange, and they're also going to have some muscles associated with them that are going to help to make that process a lot more efficient. In some cases, there's also going to be a role in feeding that's played by these. Lastly, we're going to have them be more active. They're going to have more muscles, which is going to go along with this. and they're going to have things like heart, kidney, structures of that nature associated with them. So overall, a lot of additional structures that we didn't have in the earlier groups. If we look at the most primitive of the craniates, this brings us to the hagfishes. Hagfishes have a skull that's going to be made of cartilage. So this skull is not made of the typical bone that we think of when we think of a skull. These aren't going to have any jaws. They're not going to have any vertebrae because, again, you don't have bone structures actually here. These are going to retain their notochord as an adult organism, and they have teeth made of keratin. When we say made of keratin, this would be the same thing that makes up our fingernails. All of these are going to be marine organisms. They're all going to be bottom dwellers. These are going to feed primarily as scavengers. So they would feed on dead organisms that they might find on the ocean floor. These also have an ability to produce a lot of slime. So if they're threatened in any way, they can ooze a lot of slime directly through their skin. And this is going to deter predators or other organisms that might be trying to kind of encroach in on their food supply.